In this video, I want to talk with you about the difference between discerning the fruit, testing the spirit, and judgment. So earlier today, I uploaded a video regarding why God afflicts. And the reason why I addressed that question is because someone had sent me a video trying to understand, we know that God afflicts his people when he is holding them close, he's keeping them low, he's bringing them in to talk with them or address their sin. But this particular person wanted to understand, why would he afflict non-Christians? One of the things that I mentioned to you in that video is that though there are people who identify as Christians now, doesn't really make them Christian just because they say that they're Christian. What makes them Christian is whether or not they're worshiping God in spirit and in truth. And we know that there are many people who identify as Christians who do not live that life. They don't truly believe in him. They seek idols to heal them rather than seeking God, who is their healer. We also know that there are going to be others who are brought into him. And scripture seems to let us know that these people may not be the people that we have been calling Christian, those who go to a church, for example. And if you remember, the teachers of the time when Christ was here were the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and Christ told them that prostitutes and tax collectors were getting into the kingdom of heaven before them. So we need to be very careful about how we are discerning, testing, and judging. So let's talk about the definition of each, and then I'm going to kind of give some examples of this. Discernment has to do with discerning the fruit. You got to discern what is coming from a person. The problem in the world is that we tend to do this in a carnal kind of way, in a cerebral way, and, everything supports that in the world. 5 signs of a narcissist, right? Well, you know as well as I do that narcissists are very charismatic. They know how to put on a mask. They know how to put on a show, at least what the world calls narcissism. They know how to chameleon, and they know how to be the nice guy or the nice girl until the mask comes off. And so it's very dangerous for us to be discerning based on a human or worldly standard of what character looks like. We have to discern the fruit as God has taught us to discern the fruit. I was speaking with someone the other day who was telling me about one of their friends. And what she was telling me is this person uses a lot of drugs. This person engages in sexual immorality. But the other thing that they were saying is, but they're a really good friend. They're really sweet. They have a great heart. This is something that I hear a lot of times in the world. But the word tells us that we need to discern based on what the word says, on the standard of the word. And the word discerns these type of people who engage in these behaviors, in sexual immorality, in drunkenness, which, would be drug use would be the modern day drunkenness, right? I mean, it's in the same category. These are people who live by the flesh. So we're discerning that. We are discerning that by the fruit that is coming from them. That is the fruit of living by the flesh. And the word tells us we are to have nothing to do with people who do these things. Absolutely nothing to do with people who do these things. So we discern the fruit, and we have a pretty good idea of the spirit that comes from. We have a pretty good idea of when we test that spirit, what's going to come out. The interesting thing is that people who live in this way have a certain way of living and a certain way of relating, and they elicit certain interactions with us. And so we have to be very intentional about not falling into the patterns of our own flesh, which is really part of the reason why we're to have nothing to do with these people, because it's very easy to fall into the patterns of our own flesh, of knowing on a fundamental level that you're not going to be able to go very deep with this person. You're probably going to make excuses for their behavior. You're probably going to be easily manipulated by their behavior. And then you start to live in a way that is not congruent with the spirit inside of you, or the spirit that's supposed to be inside of you. And you very easily get pulled into sin. So your natural tendency is not going to be to test that spirit. But the word tells us, test the spirit in another person. And how do you test the spirit? Well, you have to live authentically. You have to have real conversations with people. You have to be talking from the truth and goodness that is in God's Spirit in you. And one thing I want to tell you is that there is no good except by God's Spirit. And so if someone is engaging in these behaviors, God's Spirit is not in them. He does not dwell in them. So any definition that we have made about someone having a good heart comes from the world, and it's not real. It's not true. Because what happens is when you finally do test the Spirit, when you come to a point where, for example, that person has done something or something happened within the relationship and it comes time for you to have a real conversation about something, because of the Spirit in that person, because of the fact that that person lives by the flesh, they are always going to default back to the flesh when they are held accountable. There is no way for them to be authentic. There is no way for them to be true because the word tells us there's no truth in them. So you may have experienced this when you were worldly, when you were of the world, where you got into relationships with people and everything was wonderful. They became your best friend very quickly. And when it came time for them to take responsibility, you were shocked and grieved to find that they were not at all the person who you had hoped they were. And the reason for that is because they live for self, they live by a different spirit, and there is no good in them. The only good is that which comes from God's Spirit. So whatever good you experience from them is not sustainable. It's not going to last. You may have also experienced that when you became Christian, when God's Spirit began to truly occupy you and occupy your life, that people fizzled out. They just kind of went away and nothing really happened. They just kind of went away. There may have been blowouts. There may have been things that did happen. So you'll notice that that spirit begins to react to the spirit that is now occupying you. So we've talked about discerning the fruit that's coming from someone, because that fruit is coming from where? It's coming from their heart. You are not defiled by what goes into your mouth. You are defiled by what comes out of your mouth. And that is because it comes from the heart. So you are discerning the fruit. You are testing the spirit to see if there is actually good in them. Good that is going to be accountable. Good that is going to be consistent and reliable and repentant. Now we're going to talk about judgment. Judgment has to do with condemnation. And the reason it's so important for us to understand the difference between discernment, testing, and judgment is because in this crazy, lunatic world culture of wokeism, people equate judgment with discernment and testing. So let's look at this from a biblical perspective. We have been told to test and discern, but we've been told not to judge. And so if Satan can distort and deceive our understanding of what judgment is, to then say that if you discern or test, that now you're judging, now we are completely confused. Now truth is distorted. Do you see why it's so important for us to return to the Word and what the Word says, rather than these distortions that the world and counterfeit Christianity and man have come up with regarding God's Word? Judgment, we're not to do. Testing and discerning, we are to do. And in fact, part of testing and discerning may include dusting our feet, rebuking, reproving. And yet again, the world tells us that we need that leads to marginalization. It leads to alienation. We should not be alienating the LGBTQ plus community. We should be integrating them into churches, integrating them into our school systems, indoctrinating our children by them, because otherwise that's judgment. Otherwise, that's not kind. Otherwise, that's not quote unquote Christian. Well, let me tell you something. God sets the standard on what Christian is. God sets the standard on what kind is. And as it is, God has commanded that we have nothing to do with such people who live by the flesh. And he has very clearly outlined what are the works, what are the fruit of the flesh. As long as someone is engaging in these behaviors and they are living by the flesh, and you have tested the spirit that's in them, and you know that God's Spirit does not result in living in this way, does not produce that kind of fruit, As long as you have discerned and tested that, you need not be around those people. You need to have nothing to do with them. Now, God said in Leviticus that if you had a defiling, some sort of a rash, you went to the priest at the temple, and the priest would take note of whatever symptoms you had. He would observe the symptoms. He wouldn't diagnose them. He wouldn't give you a pill. He wouldn't do any of the things that people do in modern day medicine. He would dispense the same remedy that God established since the beginning of humanity, and that is return to God and he will heal you. That was the fundamental understanding. So when the priest said you're to go into isolation for 7 days, they knew exactly what they were to do in isolation for 7 days. They would be returning to God. And when they came out of isolation, the priest would then again take his little notes and he would say, okay, let's compare what I see in my notes, what I wrote in my notes 7 days ago, and let's look at this rash and see what's happened. If they had started to become better, they would go back into isolation and they would finish the work that God had started in them. They would go back into isolation for 7 days. If they were not healing, they would be cast out of the camp until they began to heal. Understand, you don't get to hang around in this nation that has been set apart by God to be holy. You don't get to defile this nation. Israel must remain pure. God did not instruct his people to integrate the wicked, to integrate the impure with the pure. He said, dust your feet. You are to have nothing to do with such people who live this way. This is their choice. They are living that way by choice. It's not because of an identity. It's not because he created them that way. It's not because of a diagnosis or a condition or a syndrome that they can't help. It is because they need to return to him and he will heal them. And it is because they have chosen not to do that. Now, here's where the judgment comes in. You've discerned that. You've tested that. The judgment comes in when you say that person's going to go to hell, when you say that person is not going to ever return to God. Our job, when we have reproved, dusted our feet, rebuked, whatever it is, our job is to then pray for that person, fast for that person, wish well for that person, hope that they're going to one day come to God. Because there's no one that we really, in our heart of hearts, in the goodness that God has placed in us by his Spirit, there is that part of us does not want anybody to be condemned. It's only our flesh that wants someone to be condemned. So we have to continue to work our hearts into conformity to God's heart because we are called to be holy and pure. We have no idea if we're going to stumble. We need to be praying that we don't stumble. We have no idea if that very person that we might feel like we want to judge and say that they're going to be condemned, we have no idea if they're going to get into heaven before we are. God can move anybody according to his will. Remember that when the Pharisees and the Sadducees had shown up where John was baptizing people, that he said to them, you brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? Don't think that just because you are descendants of Abraham that you're going to be saved. And he said, God can take these stones and raise children for Abraham. And then again, you see the parable of, the person who was praying in the temple and saying, oh, thank you that I'm not like all these other people and that I'm just so righteous and so good. And then the sinner comes and says, and hides their eyes and acknowledges their unworthiness before God. Which one's going to get into heaven? Which one pleases God? Judgment is regarding condemnation. And you see that just because you're discerning and you're testing the Spirit doesn't mean that a judgment has to be included in that. If you are discerning and you're testing the Spirit and you see that someone you love is not doing so well, they're not doing good, you want to pray for them. You want to fast for them. But you don't want to continue to condone this behavior. And when you remain in a relationship with someone like that and you are continuing to join them, even if you're not participating in those behaviors, but you continue to join with them, you're not only putting yourself at risk, you're not doing them any favors because your very presence causes them to justify themselves, causes them to not experience the consequence of not being able to be with people who are good. That is a consequence of living according to the flesh. And so when we keep integrating people like this, people who live this way, into our communities, into our churches, what we're telling them is there's no reason for you to change. You'll continue to receive the full benefit of getting to be around people. And in fact, we will never confront your sin. It's wrong. It is not the way that we are called to live. It's not what God has established. We have to confront. And now you can say, well, what about Jesus? He ate with the tax collectors and sinners. Yes, he did. But he confronted them, didn't he? He sat and taught them. He shared parables with them. He didn't join in that. And he didn't continue to hang out or integrate those who do not change. Now, to go back to the question that was asked of me that I addressed in the other video, what I want to say about judgment in that regard, like why is it, the question that they were asking is, why is it that God afflicts his people, but you also see non-Christians who are afflicted as well? The thing I want to tell you about that is that we don't know if those are going to be Christians. We don't know if those people who identify as non-Christians, if they're going to be saved. We don't know what God's doing. All we know, or we don't know what God's doing in their specific situation, but we do know that God, when God sends these things, his people are supposed to turn to him. Quite frankly, we don't know who God's people are because we haven't gotten to the point of salvation yet. Those who are identifying as Christians now, we don't know if they're going to continue to remain Christians. I mean, we pray that they are, but we don't know ourselves if we're going to fall. I wouldn't have thought in a million years that Gideon was going to go ahead and erect, false idols with the earrings that he took from the people, that the people gave him. I wouldn't have thought in a million years that Solomon was going to turn. I mean, here was a man who was in charge of building the temple, who chose wisdom over riches, and then all of that was added to him, and he turned and started worshiping false gods. I wouldn't have thought that in a million years. So none of us needs to be taking for granted what we have right at this very moment, each and every day. We need to make sure that we do not fall, that we endure till the end, as Jesus said, and then we will be saved. Then no one will be able to take anything away from us. But as it stands, we can lose what we have right now. And prostitutes and tax collectors could be getting into the kingdom of heaven before us. So those non-Christians, right, who are non-Christian right now, we don't know what's going to happen with them. They could get into the kingdom of heaven before us. We don't know what God is doing on an individual basis. All we know is that he has said when he sends these things, we need to recognize that he has sent them. We need to acknowledge his sovereignty. We need to turn to him and acknowledge that he is our healer, not anything else, not medicine, psychology, mental health, none of it, not even a church. Thank you so much for listening. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next video.